Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 3 of our 3-part series on multiple personalities with Dr. Stephen Braude, who is Professor Emeritus and former Chairman of the Philosophy Department at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County. In addition, he is the editor of the Journal of Scientific Exploration and author of numerous books, including First Person Plural, Multiple Personalities, and The Philosophy of Mind. His other books include Immortal Remains, The Limits of Influence, Crimes of Reason, and, of course, The Gold Leaf Lady. Welcome again, Stephen.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here.
It's good to be with you once again. And I'm particularly excited about part 3 of our 3-part series because we're going to delve into the paranormal. We've talked about, in part 1, the basic definitions and history of multiple personalities. In part 2, we began to look at the nature of human identity itself. And now I think it's important to point out that since virtually the very beginning, people have associated paranormal phenomena with both hypnosis and I presume with multiple personality disorder. In fact, as we pointed out, the Society for Psychical Research, when it was founded in the middle of the 19th century, began by raising that question.
Yes, it looked like the phenomena both of hypnosis and of divided consciousness promised a distinctive angle on understanding what's going on in cases of ESP.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned that the very early mesmerists thought that they used the term lucidity to
Correct.
describe certain states of consciousness induced by hypnosis that seemed to be involve clairvoyant abilities.
Yes, it looked like when the early mesmerists magnetized or mesmerized their patients acquired the ability to diagnose illness in others, to predict future events, and so on.
Mm-hmm. And now we know at this point in time that there are dozens of experimental research studies and clinical observations suggesting that the altered state of consciousness associated with hypnosis is what parapsychologists call psi-conducive.
I think it's very clear.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's interested me as I got involved deeply in the community of mental health professionals studying multiple personality is that there hasn't been much research, a little bit, on the connection between multiple personality and paranormal phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
It was much more likely for the clinicians themselves to confide in me when they knew about this other area of my research, to tell me about various kinds of ostensibly psychic phenomena going on in sessions with their patients, something they didn't want to write about or even necessarily admit to others in their community, but they felt safe at least in getting it off their chest with me.
So, it would seem that to the extent that altered states of consciousness in general, especially relaxed altered states and hypnotic altered states, are psi-conducive, that is conducive to extrasensory perception, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, that there might be a relationship that certain alters or personalities, subpersonalities, might have psychic gifts.
Well, and that's what some clinical reports, at least confided to me, seem to suggest. Mm-hmm. It's not something about which I recall any papers being written.
Okay.
But clinicians have often told me about their patients knowing things about them which they had no normal way of knowing. Right. But you don't have to study multiple personality to get evidence of psi in the psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic situation. Jewel Eisenbud used to write about that quite a lot, and he was a hardcore Freudian.
Well, the truth is that a psychotherapeutic relationship is an intimate relationship.
Yes.
And in general, telepathic connections seem to be associated with a wide variety of intimate
It
relationships.
seems almost to invite it, yes.
Yeah. But there's two ways to look at this. One is to say, well, do alters have special psychic gifts? And what you're saying is there's at least a suggestion of that. Rumors or stories told to you by
Let me just
other...
interrupt there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure you'd want to say that the alters have psychic gifts. I think you might want to say that the alters allow the subject's psychic gifts to manifest in a way in which they might not ever have a chance before to manifest.
Okay.
In the same way that alters who display linguistic abilities or artistic abilities never before shown by the subject might really just show that these were latent in the person all along.
Well, it might be that the base personality, the normal personality, doesn't believe that psychic abilities are possible.
Sure, that personality might also think that his or her artistic abilities don't exist.
I mean, that's not at all uncommon, that people have gifts and they're taught or they learn as they grow up to believe that they don't have those gifts.
Yes. I mean, in that sense, education might work very well at snuffing out potential psychic superstars.
And one of the things that we do know in parapsychology is that your belief system correlates very strongly with your ability to produce those phenomena in the laboratory.
Yes, and so a lot of people think that hypnotic or dissociative states might allow us to bypass our normal resistances or inhibitions against demonstrating whether psychic abilities or other kinds of abilities. And that's why you can get people to do things in hypnotic states that they wouldn't be able to do normally.
A wide range of
Yes, some of them
things.
very funny. That's what stage hypnotists make a living doing.
Yeah. Well, I had experience early in my life as a college student. I hypnotized my roommate once and told him he was a cat. And he just leapt up like 5 feet in the air and was on all fours and was kind of hissing at me until I told him he was no longer a cat.
No fur balls, I presume.
But it was extraordinarily dramatic.
Yeah, I can imagine.
In fact, I just saw that person a few months ago, and he remembered the event after many decades. It still left an impression on him. But so you have in the paranormal field mediums and trance channels who go into an altered state of consciousness and express different personalities. Often these entities aren't thought of as subpersonalities, but as external entities somehow, but it seems very similar to multiple personality.
Many of the presenting behaviors look very similar to what goes on when alters switch from one to another. And so that shows why it's not just an academic exercise to consider the relationship between multiple personality and the evidence for mediumship.
Yep.
And it's why I felt I had to write my book first person plural before tackling the issue of survival of bodily death and immortal remains. So yeah, there are certainly some superficial similarities. The million-dollar question is whether they're more than superficial.
Well, to start out with, I think it's fair to say that because you're a trance channel or a trance medium and you can exhibit multiple entities, I'll call them, coming through you, very much akin to the multiple personalities experience in dissociative identity disorder, it doesn't mean that you have a pathology.
It certainly doesn't mean that. And also, one major difference between what you see in most cases of mediumship or trance channeling and cases of multiple personality is in multiple personality, there's a kind of obvious adaptational component to the alter, which might be very obvious, or at least something you can figure out with a little bit of detective work. In the case of trance channels and mediums, or especially mediums, the communicating entities seem more related to the needs of someone other than the medium. They don't seem to have the same kind of dynamic relevance to the medium that alters have to the multiple.
More related to the needs of the sitters at a seance,
Yes.
for example.
Yes. Except in drop-in cases.
Let's define a drop-in case.
A drop-in case is where, during a seance, a communicator comes through not only unknown to anybody at the seance, but uninvited. Someone or a communicator apparently with his or her own agenda, some issues that need to be worked out.
Well, I suppose it's fair to say right now that we have over 100 years of history and many, many dozens of documented clinical reports of multiple personality disorder.
Yes.
And over the same period of time, or even a slightly longer period of time, we have hundreds of cases of mediumistic seances that have been observed by researchers and reported on. So we have a big database of both.
The database is even larger in a way than you have indicated, because prior to the discoveries of Puisségur and others about a second level of consciousness, cases that might now be diagnosed as multiple personality might have been diagnosed formally as demonic possession. But times have changed, the overall gestalt has changed. We now have evidence from the history of hypnosis of multiple levels of consciousness. And so some people have suggested that whether it's demonic possession or multiple personality, you're really dealing with the same kind of underlying dissociative process. All that's changed is the symptom language or the idiom of distress into something that's culturally appropriate.
And the social context.
Yes, exactly.
However, one of the main researchers in the area of dissociative disorders, psychiatrist Colin Ross, has also studied people who report psychic phenomenon.
Yes.
Commonly. And as I recall, he claims that one commonality between people who report lots of psychic phenomena in their lives and multiples is childhood trauma.
Colin is an exception in many ways. I mean, he's, first of all, not afraid to even raise the specter of psychic phenomena, and I certainly give him credit for that. And I take his clinical observations very seriously on this.
So that might be a common element, that both multiple personalities and an openness to what we can't claim that these are genuine parapsychological phenomena, because these are self-reports of people, but people who believe that they experience a lot of paranormal activity both report a higher degree than normal of childhood trauma.
Well, I mean, multiples exhibit apparently a higher degree of childhood trauma than the general population. And so there are several converging lines of evidence, those that Colin has supplied, and even that informal line of evidence from the clinicians who've confided to me about the spontaneous occurrences of apparent psychic functioning in their sessions with their patients.
I'd be inclined to think that childhood trauma, it might be like taking a very strong drug. It's going to blow away a lot of the crust of social conditioning that we have. And people are going to look for alternatives to deal with the stress that they're under. And those alternatives may involve a form of escapism into a dissociative identity, or it might involve, if alternative realities of a psychic nature exist, opening up to them.
Well, it would be an analog, I think, to those people who've reported the discovery of psychic abilities in themselves after a near-death experience. So another kind of major life trauma that might have the same effect of blowing away all sorts of former inhibitions against accessing various parts of our psyche.
Another thing about the relationship between the concept of identity and the concept of psychic experience is that most of us raised in, particularly here in the United States, particularly in North America, let us say, are conditioned to believe that psychic functioning, telepathy, and ESP are not possible. I think generally the case. I grew up in the Midwest. That was certainly the way I grew up.
It was the way I grew up.
In spite of having some religious background. It's just these things are not possible. That's how I started my investigation. And many parapsychologists today start out as skeptics.
Yeah, me too.
Wondering how is it that, considering these phenomena are impossible, anyone believes otherwise. And one strategy that has been hypothesized is known as the psychic support figure. Since my little skin-encapsulated ego, can't possibly induce psychic functioning, maybe Archon from planet Xerxes or some other entity that is not me could, because they have a more exotic background. It might be easier for me to accept that some subpersonality or some other part of my subconscious that I give a different name to could be function psychically rather than me.
Well, this raises, I think, an issue that you and I have discussed on many occasions, and that is the fear of psychic functioning. Mm-hmm. Because if we think that we really do have the ability to peek into other people's minds or to read the future, it suggests a level of omniscience that we might find just overwhelmingly intimidating.
Yeah. In fact, the way I like to put it is that Freud, I don't consider myself a Freudian, but I thought he had at least one very good insight, probably many more than one, and that is that we don't want to know what's in our own subconscious mind. All of the Freudian defense mechanisms, which I think are pretty well documented, show the various strategies we go through to avoid confronting our own thoughts and feelings.
Well, you might remember an old Twilight Zone episode of a person who flipped a coin, it landed on its side, and for the entire day when the coin stayed on his side, this person was able to hear the thoughts of all the people around him. And his life suddenly became a living hell. He heard things he didn't want to know about, and eventually he was relieved when the coin fell over, and that access to the thoughts of others was cut off.
So we don't want to know our thoughts, and you're suggesting
we don't want to know others either.
And we certainly don't want other people to know our thoughts if we don't want to know them ourselves.
Right.
So there's a lot of fear around psychic functioning, and I think every parapsychologist has their war stories about the persecution that comes from the outside, the hostility and ridicule.
Well, that's just another level of fear, of condemnation.
Indeed it is, but I often think that, and maybe I'm getting a bit off topic here, but it seems as if socially since the middle of the 20th century, we've had racial liberation, and we've had the feminist movement and the gay liberation movement. What we haven't yet had is a parapsychological or psychic liberation movement.
I wonder if we'll live to see that.
Well, I'd like to think so, but I'm not holding my breath.
No, the trend doesn't suggest it's going in that direction.
No, it's deep. It's very deep, because we used to burn witches at the stake in this country, here in North America. So there's an enormous fear of that sort of thing. But anyhow, getting back to the relationship between multiple personalities and mediumship, where do you come down on that?
It's hard to know where to come down. I would say that although the similarities between the two are sometimes quite suggestive, I don't think we're entitled to conclude that mediumship is nothing but a form of dissociation. Because there are too many cases where mediums give information known to no one present at a seance, later verified, and which strongly suggest the persistence of some kind of consciousness following bodily death and dissolution. You don't see that in typical cases or any real cases I'm aware of multiple personality. Okay. So there is that difference. And I think that's what people are really wondering about when they wonder about the comparison between multiple personality and mediumship. So that doesn't mean that all cases of ostensible communicators are what they purport to be. And in particular, when you look at so-called control personalities in cases of mediumship, these quite clearly seem to be constructs of the medium. Control personalities are communicators who act sort of like masters of ceremony to the spirit world. Their job is to introduce the succession of communicators communicating through the medium, sort of like the Ed McMahons of the spirit world. And those quite clearly seem to be constructed by the medium. They're transparently artificial. Now, if they are artificial, then I think we have to be open to the possibility that others are also, but more subtly artificial. We can't rule that out.
Well, William James looked at this question, as I recall. He became convinced that his deceased colleague, Richard Hodgson, was appearing as a communicator through the medium, Mrs. Piper.
Well, that's not my understanding of James. My understanding of James is that he was convinced that Mrs. Piper exhibited paranormal phenomena, but he was not ready to come down on there being evidence of survival in her case.
All right. Well, we'll have to keep that as an open question for the moment. I thought James at one point said he was actually convinced it was Hodgson, but
this will send us back to our books.
The point I really want to get at here is, let's just assume for the moment that that's the case. It may not be. James argued that what was going on, if it were true, is that there were two wills involved. The will of the medium to, the word he used is personate. The will to personate the deceased party, and then a will on the other side for the deceased entity, Hodgson in this case, hypothetically, to be personated. That it somehow would require a joint activity.
Well, the evidence for survival is so hard to interpret. I mean, depending on what kind of assumptions we're willing to make, it's not even clear what we would expect the evidence for survival in cases of mediumship to look like. We have to make assumptions about how easy it would be for a deceased individual to communicate, whether the person even wants to communicate, how much of their consciousness even is able to communicate after bodily death. And James, among others, suggested that communicators often seem to be in a dreamy state, like they're not fully there. And maybe that's because in their post-mortem state, they're not fully there. So I don't think, I think we have to be very careful in interpreting these kinds of phenomena because the survival hypothesis, the hypothesis that people can survive after bodily death and communicate via mediums, it's not clear what the evidence should even look like unless we're willing to introduce a whole bunch of assumptions which are not independently verifiable and which are extremely controversial.
All right. And I think it's fair to let our viewers know that you've explored this extensively, particularly in your book, Immortal Remains. In the future, I hope to do some more interviews with you
I'll hold you to that.
on that subject. But basically where you come down is that the evidence for survival is far from conclusive, and that you are inclined to think, if I'm correct, that the evidence for what is sometimes called super ESP outweighs the evidence for survival.
I'd say it's a toss-up. It depends on what day you ask me. I think for reasons I mentioned in Immortal Remains, there are some real problems for the living agent psi or super ESP explanation of cases of survival. Some have a kind of tug to them that is very difficult to get rid of. And actually the explanatory terrain here is much more complicated than we're suggesting in this little brief exchange.
Obviously, these are issues that philosophers have been pondering for over a century.
Yes.
For over a century. So we can't hope to solve them in the context of a half-hour video interview.
What I'm willing to say is that it's certainly not a slam dunk in favor of either survival or the living agent's psychic functioning alternative.
All right. That's clear. It's perfectly okay to kind of keep it ambiguous. I think the point that we want to make now, however, is at least that when evaluating mediumship or channeling, it's useful to keep in mind the considerable database that exists in the field of multiple personalities, because they each seem to, in their own way, shed light on the other.
Yes, it's absolutely important to keep in mind that in cases of multiple personality disorder or even less pathological forms of dissociation, people have the ability to create very impressive alternate personae, even when there's not evidence of survival. Mm-hmm. And there are some very interesting cases of channeling or mediumship that are very impressive as psychic achievements or psychological achievements, but not at all impressive as cases of survival. One good example would be the medium Helene Smith, studied by Theodore Flournoy, yes. Who wrote a book called From India to the Planet Mars. Mm-hmm. Helene Smith, the medium, claimed to be receiving messages from residents of Mars, yeah. And she invented a very elaborate and thoroughly consistent Martian language, both written and spoken, which after analysis turned out to be modeled very closely on her native French language. Mm-hmm. But it was clearly a creative tour de force on her part to do this. Mm-hmm. And if we don't take that kind of thing seriously, then I think it's going to be all too easy to overestimate the achievements of mediums in a more survival-related context.
And I suppose a whole other aspect to this is the question of creativity. I often think that in the parapsychological domain, there are individuals who are frustrated novelists. that many of them might be quite gifted at creating very elaborate stories if they had chose to channel their creative energies a little differently.
And we should also keep in mind how dissociation, hypnosis, or otherwise leads to or can unleash various kinds of creative abilities not otherwise demonstrable.
Yeah, we haven't even touched on that. It's such a rich topic.
Yes.
Well, Stephen Braude, thank you so much for sharing this half hour and the previous 2 half hours with me. It's been enlightening.
Thank you. It's been fun.
And thank you for being with us.